All right, chapter 4, we're going to talk about control system tightness. So what do we mean by that? Well, we're looking to see if our management control system has those tight controls that are going to provide that benefit for us, or if we have too loose controls that can harm our company. So we want to look at how that factors in. So when we look at our first part, the control and what is good control. Well, good control is going to be where we have a high probability that we're going to achieve the goals that we've set and a low probability that we're going to have surprises that could cause harm to our company. So we want to make sure that we have those controls in place. So when we look at tight results control, it's going to depend on different factors that we're going to have to think about. So we want to look into, what are the results that we're looking for? So what are the end goals that we're trying to find? And we want to make sure that we have a few factors that go along with that. So the first one is going to be congruence. We want to make sure that when we look at the effectiveness of our results control, that they are in congruence or in alignment with the goals that we've set in place for the organization. So every organization is different, but when we're looking at, what do we have set up, we want to make sure that that the controls go along well with the process that we've set up. The other part is specificity. So when we look at that, we want to look at, what kind of terms have we set up for those performance expectations? We want to make sure that they're very specific. If they're not specific, then it's kind of hard to judge how we're really doing with that. So we have to think about all those parts of it. We're going to get into a little more detail in just a minute. All right, so we look at our behavioral constraints. When we talk about tight action controls, there's different things we have to think about. So when we're thinking about the behavior constraints, it can create a tight control in some areas of our company. And when we look at more of like the physical constraints, we talked about before, we can have locks on our desk, or we can have surveillance in our work areas. We can have cameras, we can have software that's really protective, but we could have a lot of different options that are physical constraints. But the thing we have to remember is they're usually going to cost a lot more. The other part is going to be the administrative constraints. So we're looking at that. That can provide a lot of different controls too. So if we're restricting that authority to certain levels in the organization or in the company, then that can create an administrative constraint. So we want to make sure that, only higher level personnel have access to the things that would involve our day-to-day decisions. And then we also want to make sure when we're thinking about them that the controls we're setting in place can prevent people from violating some of our procedures that we've set up. So again, we're going back to that same thing we saw in chapter 3, where we're having that separation of duties between 2 or more employees. We're also looking to make sure that, we can figure out how to work to prevent collusion when employees are working together. So they, 2 different employees might have access to different sides, but if they agree to work together or to collude, then sometimes they can get around those controls that we've set up. So in that case, we are looking to see, what can we do to prevent that from happening? When we look at pre-action reviews, those can make the management control system tighter if the reviews are often, if they're really detailed, and the other part is it has to be performed by someone that really knows the job. If someone that doesn't know what they're looking for is looking at that, then it's kind of hard to be, really finding what's going on or really making that evaluation. So we want to make sure that we have those strong pre-action reviews done to make sure that, we are testing or kind of auditing where things are to determine what we should be doing. When we look at how are we holding everyone accountable for it, that's that action accountability. So we're looking at that first. We have to make sure that, to have that tighter action accountability controls, we first have to have congruence. So that's what we're looking at. What does the performance look like of the actions we put into place for the controls? Do they lead us into the direction of what our organizational goals are going to be? Are they putting us in the right place? If they're not, then we have to think about how could we revise that action control to make a little more sense. So the other part we have to look at is sometimes we're going to have the actions that we're trying to avoid or the undesirable actions. So for those, we have to think about what can we do to prevent that. And again, some of that is just defining what do we consider to be acceptable and what is considered to be unacceptable. Sometimes just by stating the mere fact of this is okay or this is not okay, then you can create the effect that you want by getting them to follow the policies and procedures you put in place. The other part we want to look at is how effective is that action tracking system. So when we have those controls laid out, we know how we're monitoring those actions. We want to make sure that if someone goes off track, we have some kind of procedure in place to let them know how they're going to be held accountable. So that goes into that tracking system. So we're looking at the control in the accountability system, and we want to make sure that employees know whether it's good or bad. We're going to recognize that they're doing something that's especially if it's good, we want to recognize that. But even if there's something that they're not doing right, if we have a strong action tracking process, then that's going to allow us to see those irregularities sooner or make notice of something that might not seem quite right. So we want to make sure we have those in place. The other part is we want to make sure that we have action reinforcement. So we're thinking about that one. We want to make sure that we're enforcing those controls by making the rewards that we're offering for them doing well, or the punishments that we have set up for them doing something that violates a policy or procedure, that they're spelled out so that we know exactly how to do that. So depending on the size of the incentives, then some companies have more control. It depends on what kind of a budget you have as to what kind of incentives you can set up. But not all incentives have to provide a financial reward. You can have like a day off that you give them. You could have a dress down day. There's a lot of different reinforcements you can offer as a reward that would motivate your employees. And that's the end goal that we're trying to get to. The other part is we want to make sure that, if they're doing something wrong, we do have a clear policy of what happens so that if we have to take disciplinary action and, or if we had to let them go, they know the rules of how it was going to work before we ever got to that point. So the next part goes into talking a little bit more about specifically the congruence and completeness and then the specificity. I hate that word. But so we're looking at congruence. We're looking to see what kind of control system is going to give us the same objectives and make sure that we're able to monitor it. So we want to make sure that it's a strong system and that we're able to track it to make sure that it's meeting our real objectives that we've set up for the company. The other thing that we want to look at is, are we creating expectations that are very specific, something that we can measure against? If we can't measure against it, then it's kind of hard to tell if you're doing something appropriately or if there's something missing. So we want to make sure that it's very specific. And they give examples for both of those in here. So the other part we want to look at is how do we measure their performance? So we want to make sure that we have things laid out very clearly. So we're talking about performance measurement. Again, it's going to depend on the measures that we've put in place as controls. But one thing that is typically rewarded would be, we're giving some kind of incentive. So those performance measures can be several different things, but we want to make sure that we have measures that are very clear and that they're also objective so that they're not tied to, a specific department that could benefit, but they're kind of open so that anyone could accomplish those goals. The other part we want to look at is what kind of reinforcements are we providing? Are we making sure that, we've been very direct in how we expect things to happen, what we put in place if they don't, and then creating a environment that it doesn't allow you to, if you didn't do it right, that you have some way that you can make up an excuse and get around it. We want to make sure that it's very clear and concise. The other part, if we look at tight personnel or cultural controls. So sometimes those management control systems are that are dominated by personnel or culture are considered tight. So in that case, we want to kind of look at, how can we put things into place to make sure that our personnel controls are tight, because it depends on how we set up those objectives. So again, those original objectives that we set up for controls, they become even more important. When we look at cultural controls, they're often pretty stable. So an organization's culture can be very strong if they have shared beliefs and values that, again, we went back and we talked about, hiring someone that goes along with your culture. If you hire someone and put them in a job that is completely against the culture of your company, what's the likelihood they're going to be successful? It's probably pretty low. So you want to make sure that we have things in place to prevent that. And then the other part talks about control combinations. So when we're thinking about that, we want to make sure that we're looking at, if we want to get that tighter control, we can't look at just one factor. So you should look at all of the factors of your business and how do you make yourself successful, so that when you're thinking about that, you can go in and apply various controls. So again, we want to have the results controls. We also want to have action controls so that we can monitor them. All right, so that wraps it up for chapter 4. We're going to look at chapter 5 next.